This is the second video of the third lecture. You will be introduced to list in this video. Previously, we learned that whenever we have a pattern repeated in several continuous lines, we would better use for loops or while loops. After watching this video, you can describe why lists are created, you can recognize where to use lists and what patterns can be replaced with lists. You can develop programs using one-dimensional and two-dimensional lists, and you are also able to use the important methods of list. First, pause here for a minute and write a program that gets 6 integer numbers and calculates their average. You can only use print, int, and input functions. Your answer should look like this. You may not use the variable names that I use here, but I'd rather use, A0, A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5 to get the variables, store them, and calculate the average. We used the previous code to learn why we need one-dimensional list. But first, let's learn what a list is and how a list can be created. A list is a collection of several data types, several numbers, several strings, or several numbers and strings. A list is ordered and it can have duplicate values. As you can see here in the first line, a list called A is created using a bracket, and three numbers are given to be stored in this list, 1, 2, and 3. As you can see on the right side, Visual Studio Code creates a storage box with three inner storage boxes. It calls the first one 0. So everything starts from 0 in Python. So the 0th storage box stores 1. The first storage box stores 2, and the third storage box stores 3. If you print a simply, the bracket and the numbers in between them separated by comma is printed. If you print a bracket 0, the first number in the list is printed, which is 1. So 0 is the index of of that element that shows the first element in the list. If you if you execute b equal to a, it doesn't create a new copy of a, but it just gives another name, an alias to a. So b and a are exactly the same. They point to the exact same list in the RAM. So if you change b, like b bracket 2 equals to 9, a is also changed. However, you can create a copy of a list using the copy method. So write down the name of the list, which is A2 here, put a period, a dot, and then write down copy. Or you can use a bracket colon to create a copy of a list. As you can see here, executing this line will create a C as a copy of A. And you can easily clear the list using c.clear. So you see a list has several methods. You have learned two methods now so far, copy and clear. So after clearing a list, if you print that list you would only see the brackets, and there are nothing in between the two brackets. The third important method of a list is append. Append will get an argument and add that argument to the end of the list. So here, as you can see, C append A adds A to the C, and then append B will add B to the end of the list. You can also choose where you want to uh, insert, a new number, a new element using the insert method. So you can see here that insert gets uh, an index as its first argument. Here it's 1. That means what is going to be given should be stored in storage number 1. And the second argument is what should be contained, what should be added to the list. So as you can see here, 2 and 9 are shifted to right, and a new storage box is created. And all is stored in that storage box. If you want to remove, an element using an index, you can use pop. Uh, this method gets the index, for example, here number 1, um, which is all, as you just saw. All was stored in storage box number 1. When you say a pop 1, all is removed from the RAM and is stored in the variable on the left. The variable is called S, so all is stored in the S. You can use another popular method called sort. Sort can order the list alphabetically or numerically. If you don't give anything, it's sorted according to the popular way of sorting from A to Z from 0 to 9. But if you give an argument of reverse equal to true, then the sort will do a reverse sort in a descending order. So as you can see here, a.sort reverse true will change the A from 1 to 9 to 9 to 1. You can also use del to remove a string or a list. So that's not a method of list, but it's quite popular. This is a popular way to remove a list from the RAM, so that we don't use too much memory. Especially this is important for games. You can remove by value as well. C.remove B will look for B in the C, in the list C, and removes that value. A.append we already mentioned what it does. It adds an element to the end of at the end of the list. A.reverse is very similar to A.source reverse equals to true. It reversed the order of the list. You can see that you can also use a double colon -1 to do the same thing. So as you can see here, A was 9212. After executing this line, A becomes 2129. You can also use index to return an element, the location of an element in the list. So for example, a index with 2 as the argument will look for 2 in the list. The first 2 that it finds, which is in storage box 0, will be returned, as the result of this method. So a 0 is printed, which shows the index of the location of 2. A.count2 returns the number of elements with the value given to the count. So here, count will look for 2 in the list. It finds two twos, so it returns 2. A extend C will append C, add C at the end of the list A. As you can see here, A is added as the fourth storage box to string A is added as the fourth storage box to the list A. And print len A, prints the size of the list. It's very similar to the same len that you learned for strings. So what are the common mistakes, that students, have in this course using list? So as I just mentioned, the correct code for appending is a.append 6, a.append 5, and as a result, 6 and 5 will be stored in A. But I see that some students don't know, they confuse append with, for example, copy or other function methods that return something. Keep that in mind, that append as a function will place none, in the variable behind the equal. You should never use append with, equal sign, or if you use it, the variable behind before the equal sign will be none, will be nothing. So using, append and other methods should be done in a careful manner, because you can easily cause trouble for your codes. The append method returns none. What that means is that um, none is not the same as an empty string or a blank space, or none or nothing as strings, or zero or false. None is a data type of its own. Only none can be none. It doesn't have any examples of, we don't have any other example of this none. For example, for int we have 1 2 3 4 -1 -2. For none we only have none. So the append method returns none. Keep that in mind. Now that we learned how to create and use list, let's learn where to use list. So why do lists exist at all? So we use list if we have a pattern in several continuous lines, and this is the important part, and the pattern is part of the name of the variables. So as always, we will start with a totally, like a totally stupid programmer, without no loops. So we write the code. Then we try to identify the fixed parts and the changing parts, the red parts. Here you see that the red parts are part of the name of the variables. So we have to replace, that, those red parts with, with a variable name like I. That's what we learned in the previous lectures. But because they are part of the variable names, all of them will turn into AI, 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 AI. So as a result, if you just use AI, 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 you would just put all those numbers into one variable. So the previous number will be erased, and the new number will be placed in AI as a result of, having just AI there. So what computer programming language designers add here was a bracket to just show that, this A is, can have, several storage boxes inside. So as a result, what you try to store will be stored, under the name A, but, in a different, it can be stored in different storage boxes. So how do we change things when we see that, the changing part is part of the name of the variables? First, we need to define a list. We see here that we have six variables. We are going to start giving them an index from 0 to 5, and then we just give them a number. So uh, here to just define the list, I used 6 zeros to define A. You can also write down bracket 0 multiplied by 6, or bracket none multiplies by 6 if you don't want to be judgmental. That means, you don't want to have assumptions regarding, what should exist inside the list. Then you try to replace the pattern, with for loops. So here, as you can see here, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, uh, they have to be replaced with bracket I, put an indent before that, and then write down the for statement for I in range from 0 to 5 plus 1, which is 6. So as you can see here, we were able to turn uh, those patterns, those several lines with the same patterns, replace it with a for statement. But you may be able to see some other patterns here as well. That pattern is, the total part. Total is equal to A0 plus A1 plus A2 plus A3 all the way to A5. This is also a pattern, but there is a pattern here as well, but the pattern is in one line. To be able to extract that pattern, first you need to uh, write them in several lines in a way that you can, figure out the pattern. So here I can turn this sentence to total equal to 0 plus A0 plus A1 plus A2. This is exactly uh, the expression that you saw in black with the black background. Now you can turn this by changing, the one command here to several atomic commands, which in which you only do one addition. So each line has only one addition. So you start with total equal to 0, then you would say that total plus equal to A0, and all the way to total plus equal A5. So this is exactly the same as the expression with the black background. Now it's easier to find a pattern. So you can see that total equal to 0 is not part of the pattern, so you just put it there. Then here you see that 0 to 5 is the changing part, so just write down total plus equal A bracket, and in place of 0, 1, and 2, just put I, and then, put an indent before this expression, and then use for a statement for I in range from 0 to 5 plus 1, which is 6. So note that here, that if you don't use total equal to 0, it returns a name error. You can figure out that yourself. But there is another issue here too. Some student, rather than rather than using plus equal AI, they use equal AI. Note that if that happens, those students will have total equal to A5 at the end. So uh, in total, they don't see the sum of A4, A3, A2, A1, and A0. you see here that we still have a kind of pattern here. We have two for loops that look similar to one another. So what we can do here is that a total equal to 0 can be put anywhere in the code, anywhere before the second for loop where we need it. So we just move it to the beginning of the code. And now you can see that the for loop part is repeated. What you can do is to just aggregate the commands under the for and put them close to each other, and uh, that code also produces the same result. Again here, you learned in the previous lecture that it's not good programming to have fixed numbers here, and you see 6 here as a fixed number in the for statement and in the last statement, which is print total divided by 6. So 6 is repeated 6 times. In a equal to 0, you still have 6 zeros. So your task is to change uh, this problem, to resolve this problem using the materials you learned in lecture 1 and lecture 2, or in lecture 2. So pause here for a minute, find the pattern here, and shorten the code as much as possible. So this is the answer to exercise 1. We discussed that, in class, in the interactive class if you want. So now that you learned the pattern that should be replaced with a list, let's learn how to traverse a list, how to create a list. Two common actions that developer use to deal with lists. Traversing a list is the process where you try to access each and every element in a list. And you have two options to do that. Note that in these examples, I'm going to access those elements and then print them. Uh, in the first option, we use two functions, range and len, to create indices, a list of index for each element. So as you can see in the first line, for I in range 0 to len a, the, I give the size of the list a to the range function, and it creates all the indices for me. And then in the print function, as you can see, I will use brackets to return the value of that specific index. The second option is using the in operator to return simply all values. So here you just simply say for n in A, and then you print n. What is I see, as a mistake that is quite, popular at the beginning of using uh, a list and traversing a list is confusing the two options. So here you can see an example of a wrong code where you try to traverse the values, but when you want to access the element in the list, you rather than using n, which is the current element's value, you would give n as an index uh, that should be retrieved using brackets. So this is wrong. Keep that in mind. The easiest option is option 2. So try to use that most all the time, unless you need both values and indices of elements. Then you have to go for option 1. The second popular actions for a list is to creating a list using other list. Assume that we have A, which is a list of numbers from 1 to 9. And now we want to create B, uh, uh, and B is an exact copy of A. So again, we can traverse A using the values or using the indexes. So first, let's assume that we want to traverse A using the values. Here again, you have two options, option 1 and option 2. Uh, Option 1 is to just use for n in A and simply uh, use B append n, which traverse the values and creates the B. We have a shorter version of option 1, which is called list comprehension. Option 2, you can see that I simply wrote down n for n in A, and I put this statement in a bracket. This would be exactly, this command exactly creates, uh, the same B, uh, another copy of A. So here, note that, you have to always start with the element, with with the element of the list, the given name for each element, which is n here, and then you can simply write down for n in A. There is no colon required in this action. Of course, you can also use the indices to traverse list A. So here, uh, again, for I in range 0 to len A, using this range and len, you create a list of indices, and then you append not I, but A bracket I. So keep that in mind. That's another common mistake that we have repeatedly. I see that happening to our students. And the second option is again a list comprehension. Rather than traversing the values, you traverse the indices by but this time, using list comprehension. For I in range 0 to len A, so this will create a list, but a list of, indices, but keep in mind that again, you need to use A bracket I. Okay, pause here for a minute and try to create a list that includes only the odd numbers in the list A. And I need you to use both, value iteration and index iteration. Here is the answer for that. We will discuss that, in class if you want that. Now that you learned how to work with one-dimensional list, let me introduce you to two-dimensional lists. You can create two-dimensional lists by having brackets, inside brackets. As you can see here, A has two rows. In the first rows, we have element of 1, 2, and 3. And then in the second row, we have the elements of 4 and 5. So as you can see here, 1, 2, 3 in brackets is itself, a list. And A is a list of list. So that's why it's, called a two-dimensional list. We can also have three-dimensional list, n-dimensional list. But usually in this class, we only need, maximum a two-dimensional list. So if you try to print A, that's, exactly, you will see the same brackets and numbers. But if you try to print A bracket 0, then you will see only the first row of this list, which is 1, 2, and 3. And if you want to have access to an element of this two-dimensional list, like the element in the 0th line, which is the 0th row, which is 1, 2, 3, and the third column, then you need to use two brackets. So some students would confuse here and they would use only one bracket and they separate 0 and 2 using a comma. That's wrong. You need to use two brackets, one for the first, one for the row, and then the index for the column. And please keep in mind that the list can be changed. You can easily choose an element and changing that. Here, for example, you see a bracket 0 bracket 1 equals to 7. So that element is going to be changed. Note that, if you try to use b equal to a0, you are not going to create a new copy of, a0. You are going to give, an alias for a0, which is a b. So if you try to change b now, use by saying b bracket 2 equals to 9, you are going to change a as well. You may think that you can copy, a two-dimensional list by using the copy method of, a list, but that's wrong. If you write down, for example, c equals to a dot copy, and you try to change c, you will see that a is also changed. So that's because this copy is just a shallow copy of A. If A is changed, C is going to change. If so, it's just again another alias. So how can you do a deep copy of A? So what you need to do is to first create uh, D as an empty list, then try to copy row by row. So you start with d bracket 0 equals to a0 dot copy, and then you do the same for the next rows, and you go on like that. Note that this is not gonna work for a three-dimensional list. You always need to go to the row to the dimension that has no list inside, so that you can uh, create a deep copy. So this is, again, the common mistake that I see. Students try to copy a two-dimensional list by simply using a dot copy or a bracket colon. So the solution is to just copy row by row for two-dimensional list. Uh, let's see how we can traverse and create two-dimensional list. Again, for traversing, you have two options: using range and length to create indices, or you can use the value iteration. So in the first option, uh, you need to make sure that you create, you traverse the rows, first. So whatever you put in the first for statement, note that that variable in the first for statement is going to be the index of the rows, and the variable in the second statement is going to be the index for the columns. And as you can see in the second option, which is again the simplest option, you can simply use value iteration by saying for row in A, for n in A, and then do whatever you want with that element. Again, you only use option 1 if you need both values and indices. As you can see, that I need this, I need to use this option for exercise 3. Creating a two-dimensional list, using another list can be a little bit more complex. Again, we have 4 options to do that. The first two options that you have is can be categorized under value iteration, and uh, the other two options can be categorized under index iteration. So uh, it's very similar, in nature to, creating a one-dimensional list, but you need to take into account that, if you want to use option one for value iteration or option one for using index iteration, you need to create, an intermediate list called C and try to add the elements of each row to C so that then you can append that list to B. So keep that in mind. This is quite important. Other than that, the only way that you can learn these codes is to traverse, line, execute them line by line so that you can see what happens. So I leave reading this part to you. So for exercise 3, I need you to develop a complex solution. And this question tries to help you to find patterns in codes that are replaced with two-dimensional lists uh, and also create and traverse two-dimensional list. So for this question, you need to develop a program that gets a 2x3 matrix and a 3x2 matrix from the user, and then calculate the multiplication of the two matrices using no other packages like NumPy. So I explained how this is done in you know for in a mathematical way. So your goal is to create a solution for this. So this is how the solution looks like. I leave understanding this solution to you. But in the next slides, I explained step by step how I created this solution. It is in a way a copy of what we have learned in the past, 3 lectures. So that's why I just don't want to go and repeat myself. Um, there's nothing new. It's just application of what we already learned. So as you can see here, I again start with, like a stupid programmer. I only use int, input, print, and simple operations. Then I can see that there are two patterns here. I call pattern one, problem one, and the second pattern, problem two. And then I use divide and conquer to resolve the issue, turning these patterns to for loops and lists. So as you can see here, I found, the first pattern that is repeated every uh, 3 lines. Here you can see that, the red part is the only difference between the lines that are attached together. So again, what I can do is to just simply turn them into for loops, just replacing the red numbers with, a for loops with variables, and then use for loops. So again, in this model, in this code, again, I see uh, the, that there is a pattern. I find, those patterns and then turn them into, another for loop. So I'm going to have a nested loop here, and problem one is solved like this. Now uh, I can, attack problem number two. So the focus would be on calculating the result. There's a pattern also in calculating the result. So I just need to find the patterns in continuous lines. As you can see here, this is the red parts is the changing parts for each line. So I have to turn them into a for loop. Then, I'll find another pattern in the continuous lines. So I'm going to turn them into another for loop. Then I see that, the four statements are very similar to one another. I, I need a third loop statement, for loop statement, to, turn this uh, pattern in continuous lines to a shorter code. So that's the result. You see that I have three for statements here. So it's triple nested loops. Uh, you can create, if you want to create this yourself, please, follow the steps that I showed you so that you can have a full understanding of what happened. Note that you can do the calculation way easier and I using NumPy, and I showed that in the append. To summarize what we learned in this video, uh, I can say that first we learned what pattern can be replaced with list only if you see that the name of variables are being changed in several continuous lines, and those changes are only in the numbers that you have given to those variables. Then you can replace them with a list. We also learned that to traverse a list, we can use value iteration using the in operator, and then use exactly the value inside the for loop. You use this traversing method if you only need the value of that element. However, if you need both value and index of an element, then you have to go for index iteration, where you use range and len to create a sequence of indices for that list, and then try to use brackets to get the value of an element. We also learned about two different methods in creating list by traversing and using the append method, and the second option was creating list using list comprehension. Um, you can use list comprehension in the exam, but I won't suggest that because it makes debugging a little bit difficult. So unless you have full confidence in yourself, don't use list comprehensions. We also learned that we have two types of copying of two-dimensional list: shallow copy and deep copy. Shallow copies only provide a different and an alias for the in the lists that are inside other lists, but deep copies creates a complete uh, copy of every elements in the list. So a completely new list is created. Reading the appendices is optional, but I would like to invite you to take a look at them to get familiar with a professional way of doing things and reviewing what uh, reviewing some materials from the previous lecture using the codes that you have just seen in this video. You can see that I explained how you can get several numbers like a professional. How can you get matrix an n by n matrix in a professional way? I just showed you how this can be done like a stupid programmer or a simple programmer, but how professional programmers get values. So this is how they do this, and uh, it's good to know that the calculation that I developed there can be done way easier with NumPy package. It has a matmul um, method that can do that for you easily. And there are, I showed here how you can create 100 random numbers and how you can replace patterns of, strings. So there are different ways to do that. I already explained that to some extent. And also keep that in mind that fixed numbers can still cause trouble. So there is a solution for how to resolve this issue. So we already learned that in lecture 2. But I wanted you to have some, to see that again. So with repetition, you learn better. Okay, with that, we reach to the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, please ask them, in the discussion section for this module or come to the interactive lectures.